Hello, and welcome back to Radical Engagements, where you finish Alex Hochuli's Technofeudalism versus Total Capitalism in American Affairs Journal, which is a discussion of the Durand, Dean, and Varoufakis' takes on techno-feudalism. I keep on adding the neo because that's one of the issues. Let's get into the section naturalizing capitalism, because I do think Dean actually unintentionally contradicts herself by limiting what the key salient feature of capitalism is to just exploitation. Naturalizing capitalism. Dean accuses Morozov of naturalizing capitalism through his supposed dissolution between the difference between the modes of production, abandoning, quote, any effort to recognize and specify system change. Although this is unfair, for both Morozov's argument and mine here is not an extraction of surplus is the same across history, and that there's nothing to be done about it, nor is that as impossible that other forms of domination might emerge. Yeah, I mean, I do know some people who do think that the extraction of surplus is the same across history. Some of them have even been on the on the main show. I don't think that. But that's not what Morozov argued. Rather, it is that techno-feudalism rests on a misunderstanding of pre-capitalism, as well as a misidentification of contemporary tendencies in a specious analogy between historical epochs, which I agree with, and I think Morozov was maybe too nice about it. Moreover, once these errors are stripped away, all that is left is a vague hand-waving about the mere possibility that capitalism's own dynamics can transform it to something else, something worse. Well, maybe it always sucked. Dean rejects the notion that she's arguing that capitalism is moving in reverse. But all she has to return is to insinuate that the means one holds to a linear progressivist notion of history. To add to the added intimations of Eurocentrism, whereby critics of techno-feudal idea work on the presumption completed process of real subsumption, in which capital's continuous encounter with an absorption of non-capitalist elements is neglected. But the argument here is precisely the opposite. Really existing capitalism, particularly in the periphery, has always had moments of expropriation as well as exploitation. And in fact, if it wasn't for the expropriation, it would be hard to see what is happening in the developing world, because when you focus solely on exploitation, the exploitation rates formally defined in Marxism aren't very much higher between the two regions, but the expropriation is, all right, which is, you know, and there's some other things. There's hindering of rates of exploitation, as in Johnny Smith's Capitalism in the 21st Century goes into it. My point about this is that a lot of this is based on very superficial understandings of exploitation and expropriation, and ones that don't deal with what is happening in the developing world. Because if you say capitalism in the developing world is all about exploitation, then you'd have to say that capitalism in the periphery isn't capitalism. Now, I don't think anybody has tried to claim that, including Samir Amin. All right. It is that techno-feudal theorists who seek to ignore this by depicting capitalist decay in the core as constituting wholly novel elements. That is novel to capitalism, but supposedly evocative of feudalism, even though we've seen this happen in the periphery all the fucking time. And this is my argument. Peripheries come home. Third worldists were kind of right about the Fordist period. They weren't right that there were no exploitation of the proletariat in the developed world, but they were kind of right about other stuff. And I'll cover that in my series on third worldism and why I kind of piss everybody off because I split the baby on it. But nonetheless, Dean's argument must be flipped. Techno-feudal theorists are the ones who naturalize capitalist on freedom. Take Varoufakis. Whereas rent reeked of vulgar exploitation, profit claimed a moral superiority just as a reward to the brave entrepreneurs risking everything to navigate the treacherous currents of a stormy market. The tone might be sarcastic, but there is nonetheless a valorization of profits over rent. Capitalist mega firms like Ford, Edison, and General Electric generate profits that outrated rent and propelled capitalism to its dominance. I mean, that happened before those, but whatever. However, like the remora fish living parasitically in the shadow of the great shark, sub-rentiers not only survived, but in fact flourished by feeding on the generous scraps left in profits' wake. I mean, if you read Arnold Myers, you realize that the rentiers, the feudal lords, didn't even get totally dispossessed until World War II. And in Britain, still haven't. But anyway, the problem is not that he recognizes capitalist progress, the historical necessary process of development and the conquest of the feudal Malthusian trap. This is right and good. It is to hive off profit making as capitalists and other seemingly extraneous features as belonging to some deep swampy past. Landowners and rents are part of capitalist social totality. So are monopolists. In fact, monopoly capital was a thing. Now, I'm going to say that we're not in the same period as monopoly capital. Fordism was highly profitable as it was a period of intense industrialization. So it had high GDP levels, and it had a high enough GDP levels to support things like social democracy or Keynesian social welfare or whatever, or, you know, neo-New Dealism and the Eisenhower military industrial complex. It had the profits to do that. But it didn't have them for more than 15 years, ultimately. Varoufakis complains that Claudius wants you to exit the market altogether, as one does supposedly when one enters Amazon. Enter Amazon.com and you have exited capitalism. But not only is capitalism not exclusively characterized by markets, no, many societies have markets. Only libertarians used to argue the other. It has always been the case that every capitalist is a monopolist in his dreams. Some may ideologically affirm competition, others may think it's for losers, Peter Thiel, but all may take price setting and super profit sucking as a privilege afforded by monopolism, or at least monopsony power, and they all fucking want it. In fairness to Dean, she accepts the risk of neo-feudalization hypothesis is inadvertently defending capitalism against the extra economic coercion, dependence, and violent expropriation of neo-feudal pillage and plunder. Capitalism may not look so bad. She thus calls out Joel Cochrana's neo-feudalism for, quote, using the threat of mass serfdom to defend suburban home ownership, fossil fuels, and the American dream. Quote, this populist defense of carbon capitalism is not only distasteful, but impossible, because capitalism is an alternative to neo-feudalism. Capital itself is neo-feudalizing. Desperate to avoid the horrors of suburban home ownership, Dean wields her neo-feudalism as a means of bringing the struggles of today's proletarian neo-serfs together by showing that they are all struggles against capitalism's self-transformation. But they're not, though, and they wouldn't be anyway. But if we are realistic about the nature of political struggles today, about resistance to technological surveillance, domineering Silicon Valley capital, deindustrialization, ruling and low productivity service economy, we must recognize that it is more often than not carried out in the name of post-war arrangements, at the very least tacitly. Millennial socialists wanted social democracy back, and MAGA supporters likewise, even if emphasis is different. Yeah, they want their Fordism's protectionism back, or their 19th century protectionism back. Whether it is downwardly mobile professionals or petit bourgeois at risk of polarization, these classes are alike mounting a populist offense of carbon capitalism. Durand is more careful. He is conscious of the risk of overstating the newness of the digital, and in doing so, we disarm the traditional critique of capitalism. Even if he is also worried about the opposite, relativizing the new and cherry-picking those phenomena which fit within our pre-existing schema of capitalism. His work remains a high bar in techno-feudal thinking, the only text really worth engaging with. I think there's some good parts of the Dean book, but I think the central thesis is wrong. Look around, not back. So how to describe decline? Now, I'm a decadence person, and I was a decadence person before I read this essay. I've been a decadence person for a long time. I would put it that way. As I have argued before, growing inequity and any form of social control, increased extra economic use of force, and an intermeshing of political and economic are features better understood as particular to the periphery of global capitalism. What is distinct about our age, the bad and the new, is that the conditions of the periphery are increasingly prevalent in the core, partly because profits are lower, and so you got to get something some way. But Varn, there's no tendency of the rate of profits to fall. No, there is no hard linear decline in profits. But there is a tendency to rate of profits to flaw in physical commodities. We can see it all the time. Look at any industry and look at any industry that's a physical commodity, and once it is not new, look at what its profit rate is and look at what it does to GDP growth. Now, it isn't one-to-one, but it doesn't seem to work the way one of the theses Marx puts forward for it working about fixed versus variable capital and the rise of the machines. It doesn't seem to work that way, but I do think there's real problems with long-term profitability. And that means accumulation has to be had in other ways. And if you want to call it feudal-esque, that's fine, but it isn't feudal. Not in the European sense of that term. I mean, at least Samir Amin put it as, decaying into some new tributary mode versus communism. And at least that was a way of understanding it. The work society was cited above as a feature of capitalism that distinguishes it from feudal agrarianism. Today, we are witnessing the undoing of the work society. But the work society wasn't what predominated capitalism. Piecework was the predominant mode when Marx was writing, and it's becoming the predominant mode now and has been the predominant mode in the periphery for fucking ever. And, Alex would know this, he lives in Brazil. But not in the direction of pre-modern individual subsistence production. In fact, that's going away. The peasantry is declining still. Instead, precarity is increasingly generalized, and through discipline is exercised in the workplace, it is also increasingly done across society. Extra economic violence becomes more common, and instead, as Brazilian theorist Thiago Cataneri, which I probably utterly butchered. I don't know how to speak Brazilian Portuguese or Portuguese in anything. And anytime I do, I feel like I am just speaking Spanish while poorly imitating a French person and not remembering that R's are H's. But anyway, even if the so-called core countries have to deal with the situation of catastrophic desocialization, contrary to expectation, huge amounts of resources is mobilized to build powerful repressive apparatuses of all kinds and to enrich an ever smaller number of individuals. It's not profits, it's just fucking hoarding. Dean appears sensitive to such a notion when she notes, for example, the persistence of seigneurial servile culture in a place like Bolivia, where landholding still retains feudal features. And there's lots of places in Latin America that still have some feudal holdovers. We should not have as our only image of backwaterness the European past from which Europe now emerged. There is another, an asynchronous present in the periphery, are the reproduction of it spreading to the core, which is what I think we're seeing too. The third world comes home. You might know the United States is not a third world country, but it's going to feel like it because those same things are happening here. I know. I lived in the developing world. All right. Her claim that the neo-feudal hypothesis aims to shatter any remnant of that image misunderstands the effect of her intellectual project. Her work encourages us to see backwardsness as feudal, and therefore pertaining to pre-capitalist Europe. Dean is stuck in the 1970s, a world of the developed core in the semi-capitalist periphery held back by imperialism. In contrast, a perspective that emphasizes peripherization understands that capitalism is now total, far and wide, high and low. It may be uneven, but it's everywhere. And the semi-capitalist periphery isn't all that semi-capitalist anymore. Sorry, guys. The periphery is not the source of some revolt against subsumption drawing on pre-capitalist extra-European sources. It is instead the site of an increasingly hybrid element. Informal work flourishes just like it did in the cores of capital in the 19th century. Just a reminder, undermining the hegemony of the work society, aka the Second International developed the conditions where in Europe and the United States and Canada, you saw the formalization of markets and labor. But the 19th century, even in Europe and even in the UK, the home core of capital, you actually saw lots of piecemeal work like you do in the periphery today. Anyway, some years before his death, Samir Amin observed that some people are resigned and believe that our time is not one of socialist transition, but of worldwide expansion of capitalism, which, starting from its little corner of Europe, is just beginning to extend to the south and to the east. And at the end of this transfer, the imperialist phase will appear to not be the last, the highest stage of capitalism, but a transitional phase towards universal capitalism. Yeah, the highest stage of capitalism should have been translated, and probably actually is closer would have been in Russian as the latest stage of capitalism. It is this that we must now reckon with. Capitalism has overcome all the barriers to modernization on its own terms. De-aggregarization has seen an end to the peasant countryside and most of the planet. I had an argument with a friend of mine over at Strange Matters magazines about this, but I still think I'm right. Taking conservatism as a coherent political force with it in its wake. That's why you don't see that much conservatism. You see outright reactionaryism. A different mode. The restructuring of production, direct political assault, and the disaster of barrack socialism led to the defeat of capitalism's internal opposition, the organized working class. Socialism went with it. The central paradox of our era, as capitalism triumphs, it begins to decay, as everything does at its peak. Your peak is an inevitable sign of your decay. I peaked in my 30s. I'm decaying now. You know, sorry, peeps. That's how it works. I know we all live so long that we don't want to deal with that, but that's true. If the peak of American capitalism was its just ascendancy during the post-war consensus, or maybe even the 90s, when it went out in the Cold War, when the USSR went poof internally, the very next stage is the beginning of decline. As automation and technology replace living labor, value creation collapses, undermining the foundation of capitalism. I mean, who's going to buy shit if no one has money? In total capitalism, this contradiction becomes acute. Everything is commodified, but value can no longer be stably produced. And thus you have massive bubble economies all the fucking time. All right. There's no going back. The mantra can lose force through repetition, so it's worth reminding ourselves of its meaning. There is no going back to feudalism. There's just no going back to social democracy. There's no going back to Fordism. There's no going back to neoliberalism even though we're not even totally out of it yet. But the way forward is unclear, and it always is. I'm agreeing with Alex here profoundly. There's an overlapping progressive response to total capitalism and the specificity to its features of decay depicted here that emerge. We're not going to see what it is yet. A mobilization in the name of true capitalism would seek to uphold free competition, as Adam Smith understood it, as the market is free if it is free from rent seeking. But Adam Smith never won that battle, not completely. Capitalists hate capitalism because they desire monopoly. Competition, they believe, is only for those in labor markets. They don't want to have to deal with it. It lowers their profit margins. Core doctrine proposes the interoperability or the right to repair work along these lines. The small middle class opposition to corruption, to the state capitalist nexus, and to socialism for the rich will be another entrance of such a response. But those are only entrances. They're not enough to build a coherent response to it. Whatever our socialism is going to look like, it's going to be different than the socialism of the past. Sorry, people. In the very specifically humanist philosophical register, Varoufakis and Durand both seek to rescue the liberal individual. In order to establish the notion of liberty as self-ownership, Varoufakis argues that it needs to be a comprehensive reconfiguration of property rights over the increasing cloud-based instruments of production, distribution, collaboration, and communication. And I may even agree with that, but it has nothing to do with feudalism. Durand similarly holds that resistance against individual derealization presents a serious obstacle to the consolidation of technofeudalism. The advent of the totally developed individual requires that the farewell to the market go hand in hand with a reinvestment in subjectivity. It is true that the most radical critiques of an ideology often present themselves as the most faithful adherents. Slavoj Žižek has long argued that the most effective way to be subversive is not to reject the dominant ideology, but to take it more seriously than it takes itself. although one wonders if he's ever done that, but he does argue it. This is a strategy of over-identification. To repeat the ruling ideology's own excesses would expose its inherent inconsistency. Capitalism will not return to its liberal bases. Liberalism is probably over. Capitalism may out-survive its liberal origins. Which that maybe should horrify us, but nonetheless. But the act of challenging it in the name of those values could be at root of a moment for the good and new. The problem we encounter, though, is that capitalism in decay has abandoned liberalism, be it individual autonomy or free competition, or any of the other elements we associated with historical liberalism. Go back and see your Jonathan Israel book, going through all the various kinds of liberalisms that emerged between the 15th and 18th century. This makes an imminent critique of it even harder because it's less coherent to imminently critique other than complaining about atomization. That's me talking, but that's a fact. In the more concrete political register, Varoufakis hints at a cross-class alliance because, of course, everyone wants a cross-class alliance. Everyone wants a good old popular front back. My fucking God, it's so great. It's only not worked ever, except when nation states use it to defeat fascism, but only as nation states, not internal to fascism, because it didn't work there either. Bringing together not just the traditional proletariat, but the new crowd proles, but also the cloud serfs and at least some of the vassal capitalists. Single-day joint boycotts and strikes could be the beginning. A producerist populism, which would be consistent with capitalism's own history, particularly in the periphery, where industrialization in the early 20th century in Brazil or Argentina set itself against the old latifundary rentierism. But even if we ignore, and I have no idea how to say that, latifundary, but even if we ignore the economic possibility of such a move today, when profit rates are much lower and manufacturing does not employ that many people and can't and won't because you don't need to because of the machines and automation, at the political level, it will require reorganization of the state to pursue in the pursuit of material production. And we haven't seen that happen even in states that are claiming to do it, like the US right now. The ideological resources are also absent on much of the left, as Dean exemplifies. She boldly states that reindustrialization is not an option because environmental costs are too high, a view which ignores the preposition that the only credible response to climate change rests on a huge built-out of industrial capacity, which is what I think is also true too, although it's a huge one-time build-out. It's not a perpetual industrialization. I think Alex and I might disagree on growth versus degrowth socialism. I'm not a degrowther, but I actually do think some degrowth points are valid, but some of them are also stuck in a capitalist paradigm when arguing this stuff, and I don't think it's helpful because you do need a lot of reinvestment of technology and resources to equalize things out, and you particularly need to do it if you want to do it in the developing world. Instead, she accepts the reality of servants, particularly care workers. In her account, care and reproduction cannot be fully technologized. Teachers, nurses, and other service workers are therefore a vanguard of a new class struggle. You know, the people who like the PMC or hate the PMC give the PMC too much more importance. I do think, you know, there's a sense in which the proletarianized former professionals are often the most radical elements of society, but it's not enough to reproduce society on. This concedes far too much to the low productivity information and service economy that has emerged over recent decades. Dean's assessment works to entrench and naturalize capitalist decay, seeking only to welfareize it. I would think you're going to have to do a lot more, Alex, to go in and prove that. Against such an apparently limited imaginative horizons, what does one even begin to search for a way out? It is worth remembering Theodore Adorno's words of constructed consolation. In a world of a beautiful and impressive life, decadence becomes a refuge of a potentially better life by renouncing its allegiance to this one and to its culture and its crudeness and its sublimity. The techno-feudal critique may still generate insights for a programmatic remedy to all the ills it describes could look like. But if the economy is indeed grounded in an ever-growing socialization of production, which I would actually argue that it's not, I think the socialization of production has a dual nature. So maybe it is kind of, but the socialization is more alienated in the past, and that's part of the problem here. And I would actually like to drill Alex on that because I do think this answer isn't totally sufficient to the problem. This is one of the areas of this essay where I don't agree with him. Or maybe I'm not sure if I agree with him. But I want to talk to Alex about this essay on the show because I have access to Alex. Alex and I like correspond a fair amount. And whenever I do one of these long things on his work, I usually have him on so we can talk about it. That's going to happen this time too. All right. Indeed, the economy is grounded on an ever-growing socialization of production, and we know that there is much left to be built and developed, that manufacturing essentially has no ceiling. Yes, it does. It does have a ceiling of throughputs. And there's work that could be done. Yes, there's plenty of work that could be done, even if it might not be profitable. It's particularly because it's not profitable that we need to do it, because that's why it hasn't been done yet. You know, all kinds of green energy exist that would be useful for industrial production or green life or living in a less resource intensity life, even though none of it could replace fossil fuels fully. I actually do agree with that. I think Alex would be closer to Lee Phillips than I am. Although we can come into that. My critique with a lot of the growthism is that it either really valorizes the agrarian economy, it has some weird third world schemes, are weirdly like Kohei Sato's stuff, like the actual solutions aren't that radical. And that's probably not likely to work. All right. We may yet discover that the project of modernity need not be over. And in such a realization, we may find the seeds of a new Faustian option. Or whatever. I do think the idea that you can run the entire society off of the service economy alone is a little bit crazy. The social reproduction still needs material reproduction to work, just like material reproduction and social reproduction to work. And we're kind of failing at both. If you look at the way the schools are operating and the developed capitalist core, splat. What do you do? All right. Well, that's enough for my crazy haired ass today. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. You can find more behind the paywall. I'm gonna do all kinds of stuff. Hopefully Alex comes on the show. Actually, I know he is. I've already booked him. And we talk about the end bit, because I find the end bit seems a little rushed. But this is just the necessary limits of this kind of even long form piece for a magazine. So there's only so much you're gonna get to write. And on that note, good day, sir. Protect your peace. And madam and non-binary.